Hello, and welcome back to Western Washington History. Purdy, Washington is a small community located on the shores of the Burley Lagoon and Henderson Bay. Henderson Bay had been used for generations by the Native Americans for its great fishing and clamming. The tribe was the Suquamish. The Suquamish numbered 441 people in 1857. Their territory was from Kingston to Gig Harbor on the west side of the Puget Sound. In 1855, their chief, Chief Sealth, the city of Seattle's namesake, along with others, would sign the Treaty of Point Elliott, and they would give up their lands and move to the reservation at Point Madison. With the United States government now in control of the region, they sold land to settlers and businessmen alike. The federal government's program, the Homestead Act of 1862, was a good option for those who were unable or didn't want to pay for land. This program required residence and improvement for 5 years plus a registration fee. The land could also be purchased from the government after 6 months for $1.25 per acre. Isaac Hawke was one of these homesteaders. In the early 1860s, he came to log Henderson Bay. He homesteaded the area now known as Purdy from the Washington territorial government. Canadian-born Thomas Fuller had done some gold mining at Sutter's Mill in California somewhere between 1848 and 1855. Then he went to Michigan to land himself in the census for 1870. He was in Purdy by 1883 and was a farmer laborer. In 1884, Isaac Hawke sold 19 acres of land for the price of $23.75 to Horace Knapp. Horace, a Civil War veteran, as part of the 57th Pennsylvania Volunteers, had participated in the Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862. General Robert E. Lee and George B. McClellan, with a combined total of 142,000 men, fought it out in Maryland. It was the bloodiest day in American history, with 22,717 dead, wounded, or missing. Of those, Mr. Knapp was one, and would carry a bullet in his leg for the rest of his life. Leaving the war behind, he set out for the West. By at least 1870, he was in Washington Territory. Josephine Fuller Cowley, daughter of Thomas Fuller, recently widowed, along with her older brother Thomas Theodore, came from Michigan to Washington to visit their father in 1884. They would be stuck in Tacoma at a hotel for a couple weeks, as no one knew where Henderson Bay was, and their only recourse was to write their father a letter letting him know they were in Tacoma and then wait for him to come to town. He picked them up and they got in the rowboat and rowed all night to get to Purdy. Thomas Fuller had a little cabin on the beach at Henderson Bay. When Josephine arrived, she was the first non-native woman on all of Henderson Bay. Josephine stayed for a short time with her father and hunted deer and dug clams before eventually returning to Tacoma, where she lived for a time. William Rowland, Thomas Purdy, Newman Klein, and James Ashton had fished and hunted the Henderson Bay area for years. In the early 1880s, they would talk of making the area a town site, and more importantly, a mill town. Brown's Wharf and Navigation Company put the steamer Bob Irving on a weekly route between Tacoma, Quartermaster Harbor, Gig Harbor, Henderson Bay, and anywhere in between in 1884. Captain Brown's sternwheeler sold groceries and other supplies. When the boat was due to show up, it was an event for the whole family. With a scow bow and a long overhang, the Bob Irving could run aground on any beach and run its gangplank out for the customers. That was very helpful in the days before docks were built everywhere. The boat was due once a week, and it would dump freight and mail right onto the beach. They had a small shed that the items could be stored into. Until the owners picked them up. 1885 was a busy year for Horace Knapp. He sold the land that is now Purdy to James Ashton. He also married Josephine Fuller. She came to live with him in a little house near the end of the present bridge. The next year, she gave birth to a son, Earl Horace Knapp. In 1889, she gave birth to another son named Seth. In the same year Ashton bought the land from Horace, he platted a town site. Ashton's enthusiasm for the future town was so great that Tacoma's mayor called him the mayor of Purdy. Ashton replied, "Never mind, you fellows will all be pulling for Purdy before you die." James Ashton, Joseph Purdy, William Rowland, and Mr. Sherman wasted no time setting to work, and in 1885 they built a lumber mill on a small inlet of the Burley Lagoon just down the hill from present-day Peninsula High School. There was a log chute along present-day 144th Street that brought the logs down the hill to the water. Horace Knapp greased the skids for the oxen to pull logs over. When there was a huge log that needed to be pulled over and the oxen didn't want to do it, Horace was the only one who could coax them into doing it. It was in 1886 that the mill and the town got its big break. It got a contract from the Navy. The Navy was opening a new ship repair facility in Bremerton, which would open in 1891, Puget Sound Naval Yard, or PSNS. The Navy wanted boards with a bevel on one side like clapboard siding. They used 2 saws to complete this bevel, which allowed them to save time, have a lower bid, and win the contract. The lumber was needed for a dry dock they were building, soon to be known as Dry Dock 1. There is another account that says the mill was opened around 1888, which would make more sense as to the building and opening of PSNS. Purdy soon became known as a brawling mill town. The mill's success also brought conveniences to the area, like a grocery store and a post office. The post office was on the lumber camp log raft from 1886 to 1895, after which the function transferred to Springfield, or present-day Wana. Horace Knapp left Seattle to try and strike it rich in Nome, Alaska gold rush, somewhere during the years 1899 and 1909. Joseph W. Purdy, a grocer in Tacoma, offered to supply the construction materials for the school in exchange for the town site being named after him. Mr. Purdy and his business partner, W. G. Rowland, owned a store in Tacoma. Having customers on Henderson Bay, it was a good decision for him. Horace Knapp deeded the land the school would be built on at the bottom of the hill from the current high school, right near the beach. Horace and Josephine's son attended the little school, which housed all grades under one roof. In 1909, a new school was built, also on land given by the Knapps. The new school was on Sherman Avenue, now 68th Avenue. The old building was then used as the Purdy Women's Club. Students spent every semester at either the Purdy Schoolhouse or the Wana Schoolhouse to keep both schoolhouses alive. The second schoolhouse stood until 2015, when it was demolished. The current elementary was built in 1970 and opened its doors in 1971. In 1900, the first oyster factory opened. It was called the Tyee Oyster Company, and from what I uncovered, it was owned by Harry Wetherill, but may have been bought by Pete Oliette, as the owner's nickname was the Frenchman. Articles of incorporation were filed in 1932. Tyee was worth $26,000. In 1939, it seems to have been owned by Harry Allen. Harry won second place in the local rooster races that year and was an avid rooster trainer. Jerry Yamashita bought the oyster farm from him in 1952. Jerry had been working in oyster beds since he was 13. His father was an oyster buyer and broker who came to Seattle in 1900. World War II began, and the Yamashita family were sent to Tule Lake internment camp in California. In 1945, they were released, and by 1947, Jerry had returned to the Puget Sound to Dabaab Bay near Quilcene to plant his oyster beds. He named it the Western Oyster Company. The oyster seeds he planted came from Japan because the native Olympia oyster had been picked to near extinction, as well as the size and speed of growth of the Japanese oyster was superior. At this time, he partnered with another oyster grower named Dick Steele. Together they formed the Pacific Oyster Growers Association, which still exists today. One of their first acts would be to officially name the Japanese oyster the Pacific oyster. Of course, not everyone was happy with the oyster business. The community club sent a letter to Mr. Yamashita in 1968 or 69. I will quote them now. Because we are concerned with the aesthetic environment of the area in which we live, we would like you to remove the unsightly bundles of rusty wire dumped at the water's edge in the Burley Lagoon. We also object to the dumping of oyster shells on the shores of Burley Lagoon. Also, we are aware that you have applied for and received permission from the Army Corps of Engineers to build a dock in Burley Lagoon. No public notice of such request has been made to our knowledge. We would again protest such construction as we have in the past. In 1982, Jerry told the Tacoma News Tribune that he doubted oysters would come back to Henderson Bay. By 1998, the pollution that had troubled Western Oyster Company had cleared up, and it was back to business as usual. Everything was going as planned until 2006, when the buildings were hit by fire and the loss was calculated to be $80,000. Mr. Yamashita sold the rights to farm the tidelands to Taylor Shellfish Farm in 2012. Earl Knapp married Lily Forsberg in 1916, and they went on to have 10 children. Earl, Seth, Carol, Carmen, Carl, Calvin, Brian, Norma, Forrest, and Laura. The Knapps were often called upon to ferry people across the channel, dividing their property and the spit. In 1892, the county authorized a drawbridge. This was a wooden structure supported by timber piles with a swing span at the channel. The center span swung on a pivot to permit tugs to pick up log rafts at the Wilson Logging Company. About the time the first bridge was built, settlers borrowed fill from the hillside at the Wana end of the spit to make an all-weather route. Before that, the spit flooded when high tides and winter storms coincided. They set posts to hold driftwood and brush and the occasional shipwreck to stop erosion. Earl worked as a rigger to help build the Purdy Bridge. Once completed, arriving tugs would whistle and someone, usually one of the Naps, would come and open the bridge. The second bridge was built in 1905, but strong tidal currents washed away some of the pilings and it collapsed. The county replaced it using day labor. In 1919 and 1920, the county again rebuilt the bridge, and this time it had a steel swing span. Barged in from Puyallup, nearby property owners initiated a lawsuit against it. They did not like how it looked. These experiences and troubles influenced the form of the present Purdy Spit Bridge. In 1926, Tacoma Power built towers and stretched power lines across Henderson Bay and Burley Lagoon. There were 4 lattice towers, replaced in 2018 by one single pole. On September 29, 1937, the current Purdy Bridge is completed. The reinforced concrete box girder bridge carries State Route 302 over the strait between Henderson Bay and Burley Lagoon. The innovative bridge engineer, Homer Hadley, had a large part in its design, and it was at the time considered the longest bridge of its kind, with a cost of $62,000. The Purdy Bridge is 500 feet long from end to end. It is made up of 5 spans supported by 4 piers. The piers sit on sand-packed gravel. The Portland Dredging Company built it for Pierce County. Washington State Department of Transportation would later buy it. It was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1982. Built in 1947, Peninsula High School was the only high school in the Gig Harbor area until 1979 when Gig Harbor High School opened up. This school is still in use today. Now I will comment on some businesses that are gone and some buildings that still remain. H.M. Lawrence & Sons General Store was opened in 1912. It was in the vicinity of the Cenex Feed Store on the road to Burley. The building was destroyed by fire in 1933. 14619 Purdy Drive was built in the 1930s as the Swinney Bakery. Albert and Hazel Swinney, the owners and their son Richard were survivors of the Narrows Bridge collapse. Richard was, until his passing, the last of the survivors of that fateful day. In 1945, Keith Swinney was elected as fire commissioner for Purdy. As of the making of this video, the bakery building is now home to Purdy Chiropractic Office and has been since 1988. Bob Goodenough built his home in 1936 at 13500 Goodenough Drive. The road and the creek that runs next to the property were named after him. Purdy Builders was in Purdy for at least 3 decades. Built in 1956 and originally called Flo's Bar, renamed the Flotation Device Pub and Grill in 1977 by new owner Jerry Walston. In the 1940s, there was an old Pullman railroad car converted to a diner, known as the Diner. It sat right where the Purdy Creek empties into the Puget Sound. It is said that in 1947, Ellery Cram barged it to Purdy and set it up as a diner, and then he sold it to Signo Uddenberg in 1951. Signo called it Sig's Diner. Pearl Heaton was the cook for Mr. Cram, and it is said she made the best pies. She went on to open her own restaurant this same year. Sometime after that, Huey Olmsted bought it and owned it until the early 1960s. It is thought to be under the shopping center now, used as landfill. Another diner, possibly more well-known, was owned by Pearl Heaton. She had a long history in Purdy. She grew up in a tiny house at the Purdy end of the bridge. In 1951, Pearls by the Sea Diner was built at that site, which is now known as 13802 Purdy Drive. In 1962, someone stole the payphone from the diner. As time went by, it was converted to a full restaurant. It was operating as Pearls in 1971. But I know it was there through the 1980s. Wayne Hogan bought Pearls. He also owned Bob's Burger Barn in Tacoma and Captain Nemo's in University Place. When he died in 2016, it was left to his children. It is now called Mossy Mo's. Chevron, which is still there today, located at 14317 Purdy Drive, was built by Henry and Pearl Pedersen in at least 1949 and was purchased by Paul Fatland in 1963 and renamed Paul's Chevron. It was named Paul's Chevron until at least 1985. This building is still a Chevron to this day. In 1958, Eric Hayes opened a nursery on the same land as his two-story Dutch colonial home. The home had a great view of the woods and garden plots from a large porch. He grew many different plants and shrubs. Located 7 minutes from the Narrows Bridge, it was in a great location. By the making of this film, I still had not found when it went out of business, although I am pretty sure it was there in the 1980s. This nursery could be seen from Highway 16. Mac's Stop and Shop was built in 1963 for O.E. McAllister at a cost of $40,000. It was sold and renamed Bridgeway Market in 1980, and that has been the name ever since. Although it is still the same 1963 building, it received a facelift in 2005 and looks like a much different store today. Westwind Motel was built in 1967 and still going strong with motel rooms and apartments. The Texaco gas station has been there since at least 1967. Where the Napa West Bay Auto Parts is, it used to be AA Auto Parts in the 1970s, but by the 1980s it was called Purdy Auto Parts. The women's prison at Purdy opened in 1971, and by 1972 6 inmates had made a daring escape. In 1974 the building caught fire and caused $16,000 in damage. The prison obviously is still there today. If you made it this far and found value in this video, you know what to do. This is just a sample of history of Purdy. This is just a sample of the history of Purdy. Thank you for spending time with us once again. And remember, what you do today will be history tomorrow. So make it count.